Okay, so this all looks fine. It does what it's supposed to do. We return back the message and the fact that it was true here. Inside of this game response, we do have the ability to set the player. But once we're inside a base actor, we don't actually know that the implementing member or implementing class is going to be that of type iPlayer. All we know is it's going to be of type base game object, and it's going to inherit from, or it's going to fulfill the iActor contract. So we have no idea whether or not what we're handling here is a player. It could be a monster. It could be any number of things that we want to tack into the game later on. So we come back over to the hive mind. And after looking through all that code, we say, hey, you know what? This is actually the best place to put in the player. And we assume, and it might be a bad assumption since we don't really say it anywhere in here, we assume that if something is sending a request, that it must be of type iPlayer. Right? So go ahead and cast that sender, which otherwise would just be an iGame object. So just to be clear, this is an assumption. It's something that we're reasonably sure that based off of how we've orchestrated everything, that only a player would ever be able to send us a request. And so we cast it back. That isn't to say that we shouldn't be more diligent in ensuring what we have as a player. It isn't saying that. That's a question for another day. But right now we're gonna rely on the reasonable assurance. Grun says, do you mind a different suggestion on where to set the player? No, Grun, fire away. If the suggestion is, I don't even know how to say it. Never feel bad about throwing out suggestions because you are afraid it might derail the direction. I would suggest so if anybody watching the video later on, Grun in chat has no suggestion. We're just going to feel it out and see where it might go. How about have, Grun says, how about have accept item enhance the response? That way you know in your player class that a player does not, that a player does it, and it can set itself there. Which actually is, it's a great suggestion, and we'll follow it down the rabbit hole. So inside of player, we are accepting an item, right? And the reason why I don't do it here is because that would require that the game response be a dependency for accept item. And accept item could be something that I use in the I guess it wouldn't matter if I made it a dependency and I also use it someplace else. Oh, but do I want to? Do I want to? I think it would be valid. I think it would. I think the only reason why I'm hesitant is because it breaks the consistency of the way the player class has been written. So if I were to say, I also expect a game response, like so, and then I said response dot player is equal to this, right? So I'm saying that the player is responsible for setting itself in the response. In addition to it breaking the consistency of how this is written, which makes it harder to teach because there's a lot of there's just one more kind of one-off or kind of in the margins example. Like the idea being, if you understand this signature and the reason why it was done, you should understand the next 15. The other reason is that I'm overriding this, and for the sake of where we are in the polymorphism, you definitely want to keep the interchangeability of these things as flexible as possible. And a great way to do that is to keep the number of dependencies to be as few as possible. So yes, so perfectly valid. We, based off of the polymorphism that we've introduced, we could make accept item take in a game response. So if we said, hey, game response here, oops. And then we could take and get back a game response. And again, we're seeing the way it's not necessarily more complicated, but it's essentially achieving the same thing, but with a few things I don't quite like. Totally valid. I'm just going to call a preference call on that one. And so Grun says, it doesn't have to be one-off. This could be how you do things. The other solutions that your hive mind just keeps on growing and setting weird properties and knowing too much about the actions. I completely agree with that. I do, which definitely hitches on where we're going. So every design pattern should solve a problem. And for the sake of this game and really where this is going, we want those problems to happen in predictable places, right? So in that case, we actually want this hive mind to grow a little bit because we want it to be a problem that we can solve. And right now, as I was talking about before, the hive mind's increasingly doing quite a few things. It's trying to decide whether or not you want to log in or not and branching off for that. It's doing a lot to kind of figure out if things are valid or not. When, as I said before, we really want to do just one thing. So we're going to be looking for a structural pattern that we can apply to the hive mind as a next step after the singleton to say, okay, now that I've got this singleton, now that I've got this hive mind, because so much attention is being focused on this guy, it's growing and becoming unwieldy. Is there a structural or behavioral pattern that I can drop on or drop into this that's going to allow me to lean this back down? This is what we've done in the past with patterns that have gotten things that have gotten a little unwieldy. We've been able to look to the design patterns for a solution to these problems. So yeah, so right now it is growing a little bit. Like I said, we're making an assumption here, and while it's a pretty reasonable assumption that we're making, it's not great, right? You start littering your code with these assumptions. When bugs start happening, they become that much harder to track down. When your code does something, you want it to be consistent, you want it to be predictable, and you want it to have a very granular expectation, which we don't have here. So for this reason, for the reasons that Grun brought up, we're looking at the hive mind that was really designed to be just a very lean thing, and we're seeing it get just a little out of control. And so we want to mark that as something to be a candidate for what design pattern we do next. Okay, well, let's see if we fix this bug. And let's go to parse strategy just real fast. And there was something the other day where we weren't able to pick up objects once we typed them in all lowercase. So I think there's a pretty quick bug that we can figure out. And so it's this guy. When we say get the target, we're too stringing or we're too lower and we're trimming the name, and we want to do the same thing on this side. Okay, and we're running out of time in this hour very quickly. Oh, wait. Sorry. Turney Masterbot had suggested that you could pass string t object to the server, switch on string to route to t parsing method. We kind of do that. Kind of. So we get in this console request. Try to make that as generic as possible. And then we use a dictionary as our way of breaking things up in a more granular way. So our console request actually does a bit of what you suggested, only we just bring in a string command, right? But if you look at the request itself, and bear with me, well, inside of the TCP, this request has a payload and a type. So the payload is going to be just some object, and the type is going to offer us a chance, if we want to, we can use reflection and go and instantiate that type. This does require that both caller and receiver know what this type is, but that does get to Turney's point of being able to pass in something very generic and then get into the nitty-gritties later on in your code. This could prove itself to be very helpful if we do other process strategies by the hive mind. So the hive mind is not necessarily limited to taking in console requests. We can have a variety of process strategies that can do a variety of things, and because that payload is generic. So like Turney said, having that type T is actually really powerful. It just so happens that in this process strategy, we're doing commands from the user, and because we're using an async listener, you could imagine that for a TCP server, the TCP server could have multiple listeners, and still using that same singleton, so still using that same hive mind. I could be listening for console requests on port 4000. I could be listening for server cleanup requests on port 5000, and I could have this hive mind really responding and doing different things in a really powerful way. We're inching towards that. We're inching towards it, and hopefully in later streams we'll be able to see a lot of that power. Alright, let's get back to that bug. So we hit the server, start up our client. We'll type in Gary. We're pretty sure it's going to come back fine. So we get Gary, we get Beth. Let's try get test hammer. Oh, so here we are again. F10. Our player is populated this time. We just display the command, display the status bar, and all feels fine.